Good afternoon, everyone. So nice to see you, small but mighty crew. I know it's such a busy time for everyone, and I'm just really thrilled that we're able to be together today, in large part as we start to wrap up our seminar. After spending the quarter, of course, focusing on biodiversity and food systems, we are somehow in week 10, and we will have our last guest speaker presenting for us today. Before I introduce our speaker, I just wanted to remind you that our final class is next week. So it's the December 8th is our final session. And during that session, we'll really have an opportunity to focus on synthesis of the diversity of speakers and topics that we've covered together over the quarter. And you'll have a chance to think about your final paper that will be due the following Monday, if I'm not mistaken, with opportunity to submit it anytime after the final lecture. And we'll also have an opportunity, give you an opportunity to talk to your peers and colleagues within the class and really think together, collaborate together in your thinking into a biodiverse future. So really taking the lessons that we've learned from all of the different speakers, the researchers, the practitioners, the leaders in this field, and really thinking into what lessons resonate with you, what lessons do you feel like you might be interested and excited to contribute to, either in your personal or professional life, and really how we collectively will be able to continue this important work that we've started to outline for you in the seminar. So please review the final assignments. They are up and they are necessary to submit in order to get seminar credit. So for the 400 students, the final paper is worth 50% of your final grade, and for the 500 students, the grad students, this final paper is worth 70% of your final grade. So we're really looking forward to reading your highlights, your lessons, and your synthesis. For the grad students, we're also looking to hear how you're connecting this topic and this theme with your own professional and career goals and pathways. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say about that. Any questions? Okay, clear as mud? I don't know. Hopefully very clear. Feel free to reach out with questions if any come up as you dig into the final assignment. So with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for today, the final speaker of our seminar, Melissa Spear. With an S on the end? No, Melissa Spear. I'm so sorry. I'm glad it's right on the slide. And Melissa is the executive director of the Tilth Alliance and also the Coalition for Organic and Regenerative Agriculture. And this is a relatively new initiative coalition for our state. And so today we're really going to have a chance to learn about that as Melissa speaks to us about this organic regenerative foodscape. And so these are terms that we haven't dug into really much during the seminar so far, and so I think it'll be a wonderful opportunity to both learn about those worlds and then really dig into why they matter and how it's playing out here in our own state, in our own region, and with broader lessons beyond that. So Melissa, thank you so much for joining us. I want to welcome you up onto the stage and also ask Jorge to come and get her slides up as well, and let's just give a warm round of applause for our final speaker. Yes. Yes. Thanks.
Yeah. There you go. Perfect. You can see the notes and you can see everything.
And click there to yes. Well, hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here. I'm honored to have been asked to speak with you all. I'm going to start with a question. How many of you have seen the movie Kiss the Ground? 2 people. Amazing. Okay, so the movie The Kiss the Ground has sort of popularized the idea that soil can save the world, basically. And I am here, and so it's really created this sort of utopian idea that soil is going to be this powerful tool that is going to help mitigate the impacts of climate change. And so today I actually want to dig into that a little bit deeper and talk about really how agriculture and climate change are related, and then a lot of the sort of background political and social drivers behind where we are today with regard to our agricultural systems. Just to start, I wanted to introduce Tilth Alliance for a second, because it is a nonprofit that we're focused on promoting and supporting organic and regenerative agriculture throughout the state of Washington at all scales, whether you're a gardener or a farmer. And it was started by a group of organic activists who believed in the transformative potential of organic agriculture to address issues, both environmental challenges and human health challenges. And they engaged in a successful campaign to create this organic movement, including incorporating organic certification into the Washington State Department of Agriculture. We're one of a few states where certification of organic farmers is within our State Department of Agriculture, as opposed to done by an independent organization. So it's quite a different model for organic certification. And I'm actually going to skip through. Well, I will say that we do our work through advocacy, education, supporting farmers, mostly small to mid-scale farmers, helping build a collaborative community that works together on this organic movement. And we also focus on acting to dismantle systems of inequity or anti-racism that we encounter as we are doing our work. I'm going to skip this guy. And so what is the problem in really simple terms? And the 5th National Climate Assessment was just released this November. And in simple terms, they describe the problem as the effects of human-caused climate change are already far-reaching and worsening across every region of the United States. I think that we've all been seeing this and experiencing it. And in simple terms, the solution is to rapidly reduce greenhouse gas emissions and so that limit future warming and associated increases in many of these risks. So what does agriculture have to do with this? Let's ask the question, both how does agriculture contribute to this very basic solution, and to get even more personal, how does what you eat contribute to this very basic solution? So we're going to start by looking at food-related emissions. I don't know if you've done this before, but 14% of the greenhouse gas emissions of the average American come from the food that they consume. And if we look at total U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, 11% are a result of the way we practice agriculture. And then digging a little bit deeper, if we look at that, 11%, 83% are related to food production, or the actual farming and growing of our food, while 11% of that 11% are associated with transporting our food from production eventually to retail outlets. And so if we dig even deeper and look at that 83%, we can see that about 55% is related to soil management, and that is what we're going to focus on today, is how we manage our soils. And I will say that enteric fermentation and manure management, there's a lot of work being done in those areas as well. And even here in Washington, I think there was $20 million, which are just allocated to supporting the anaerobic digesters on dairy farms, and sort of supporting farmers who want to implement anaerobic digesters, which basically turn manure into methane, which can be used as a fuel source. So there is a lot of work being done there. Today we're going to focus on soil. So what is it about soil? Soil is a powerful carbon sink and contains 3 times as much carbon as is contained in the atmosphere. And it comes in 2 forms in the soil. There's soil organic matter, and then there's inorganic forms, mineral carbon. And we're going to focus on soil organic matter, which comprises about 1 to 5% of soil, because that is where we can have the most impact. Agricultural practices primarily impact soil organic matter in soil. And historically, it's been estimated that between 50 and 75% of the carbon in soils has been released, about 30 billion tons released into the atmosphere, which is equal to about a quarter of all man-made global greenhouse gas emissions. And this is primarily the result of agricultural practices, including the clearing of land for agriculture and the conventional, what I'm going to call conventional agricultural practices, industrial, whatever you want to call it, but just sort of the primary way that we are practicing agriculture here in the United States. So if you think about, in particular, land clearing, our prairies actually were really incredible carbon sinks. There's grasses that have very deep roots. They put a lot of organic matter into the soil, and only 5% of those prairie lands continue to exist. Most of it has been cleared and converted to agriculture. And so just that land clearing, converting to agriculture was the first source of emissions, but then the agricultural practices have augmented the issue with just tilling those soils. So if we think about 50 to 75% of carbon having been emitted, there's the hope that we can rebuild the carbon in the soil, and global croplands have the potential to store 1.85 billion tons of soil carbon each year if they're managed appropriately. And what does manage appropriately mean? And that is what we're going to focus on a little bit here now. And so we can see, according to Grow Organic, that estimates indicate that with worldwide adoption of agroecological best management practices that include diversified organic farming, soils could draw down up to 157 parts per million of CO2 by 2100. And so let's look at what people mean when they talk about agroecology. So it's a holistic and integrated approach that simultaneously applies ecological, economic, and social concepts and principles to the design and management of sustainable agriculture. The unique thing about agroecology is that it isn't necessarily prescribing practices. It's prescribing general concepts, but it's also, in addition to being a scientific discipline, it's also a social and political movement. So it really is looking at the ways that the impact of food production on people, on labor, on community, on economies, and it prescribes a set of values that that are at its foundation. Now, if we look at we're going to look at these intersecting agrisystems that include conservation agriculture, climate smart agriculture, organic agriculture, and regenerative agriculture. And these are more focused on the adoption of a set of practices that are integrated into a system that result in a vague set of outcomes that we're going to call sustainable agriculture. And they all share some basic tenets or practices that include, and these are like the top 5, I would say. They include low or no tillage. And tillage, if you don't know, is basically plowing. The use of diverse cover crops, and that means that you never leave a field fallow, or in an ideal world, there will always be something growing on your fields. And so even when you don't have a food crop, in between harvest, you're going to plant cover crops to keep your fields green. In-farm fertility, so you're not importing, you're doing the best you can to not import anything into your farm, but using on-farm resources. No or minimal use of synthetic pesticides or fertilizers, and multiple crop rotations. So you're not doing a monoculture, you're not growing just one thing, you're actually bringing in various crops over the seasons. And this, I do want to say one thing about farmers. farmers, and I say this because, this is a very simplified version of a really complex system. And it's really, there is this kind of cultural image we have of a farmer as doing very simple labor, very simple work. But the reality is that farmers are entomologists, and they are climatologists, and they're microbiologists, and they are botanists, and they're engineers, and they're mechanics. And basically, it's just the most cross-disciplinary career that I have ever seen in my life. It is a very complex and very risky enterprise to engage in. So sometimes when I talk about this in these simplified terms, I need to kind of give an ode to the people who are actually making these systems work, because it is not easy. And so we're going to dive a little bit deeper into each of these 5 practices to try to understand how they impact soil carbon and climate change. And if we just compare conventional agricultural practices to the sustainable practices, you can see that they're basically the opposite. Conventional agricultural practices generally involve intensive tillage. The fields are often left fallow off-season. They rely heavily on synthetic fertilizers. They utilize synthetic pesticides and herbicides, and they're monocultures, so it's monocropping. And that is what most agriculture in the United States at this point in time looks like. So let's talk a little bit about tillage. Mechanical tillage, basically the problem is that it exposes organic carbon in the soils to oxygen. That organic matter then oxidizes and it releases carbon dioxide. It degrades and it releases carbon dioxide into the air. So there's a big movement, and this is where I get back to Kiss the Ground, where it's like people are holding up no-till as sort of like the manna that's going to, it's like everybody needs to be no-till. And I do want to point out that while we want reduction in tillage is actually very important and achievable, but that it can't be achieved everywhere all the time. Tillage does do some important things. It's important for reducing weeds. It's important for getting cover crops integrated into the soil. It's important in some cases. There's some crops that can't be grown without a certain amount of tilling, like potatoes, crops that have the root crops. And so I get a little annoyed when I hear people talk about like everyone should be no-till, because it's actually not possible. We need to be a little more nuanced and sophisticated, but trying to reduce the amount of tillage is important. Second is cover cropping. So cover cropping improves nutrient cycling. It puts a lot of organic matter into the soil. It ensures that there's always a root system in the soil. And then cover crops can also then be at the end of when you're ready to do your planting, they can be integrated into your soil, or you can bring integrate livestock into your system. The livestock will graze your cover crops. Their poop, their manure will then become a very potent organic fertilizer for your fields. And many people, that is a complicated system to enact. It was used historically, traditionally by nomadic cultures across the globe, who basically would move their, whether they were camels or sheep or goats or cows, they would move them across the landscape and they would actually graze them on cover crops in agricultural areas. And so we are now trying to, and in fact, all of these systems originated with indigenous cultures, and what we are trying to do is now incorporate some of these traditional systems into our own agricultural sector. The cover crops also reduce soil erosion, they suppress weeds, and they increase water infiltration, which in areas where there's limited rainfall, it's very important. Third, we can talk about fertilizers. And actually, if there's any one thing that can be done that would have the greatest impact, it would be to eliminate the use of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers in agriculture. Synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, when applied, will release nitrogen dioxide, which is 3 times as potent a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide. It has a shorter lifespan, but it is very potent. And we use a lot of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer here in the United States. And it doesn't even take into account the greenhouse gases that are emitted in the production of nitrogen fertilizers. And so, it's been estimated that emissions from cropland soils are equivalent to 41 million passenger vehicles driving around annually. And it is possible to substitute high quality organic fertilizers for chemical fertilizers, maybe not in every case. I think, even just limiting nitrogen fertilizers is important, but it certainly can make a big difference. And there has been data showing that organic farming systems that use organic fertilizers as opposed to synthetic nitrogen fertilizers emit 40% less nitrogen dioxide than conventional systems. Before we come to pesticides, and I think we all have some sense of what the issue with pesticides are. In general, the issue with pesticides is a lot of them are petroleum-based, and even their production contributes to the greenhouse gas emissions that we're looking to reduce or eliminate. And of course, they also have an adverse effect on soil health. A lot of pesticides will actually disrupt the microbial community within soils. Those microbes, when we look at soil organic matter, it's not just roots. A lot of it is sort of our worms, the microbial community, fungi, and when you begin to disturb those communities, it's not only that they then can be converted into carbon, but it also that microbial community is critical to making nutrients in the soil accessible to the plants that you are trying to grow. And so it reduces the productive capacity of the soil when you disrupt those communities. And of course, we know that pesticides are hazardous to human health. And then lastly, crop rotation. Here we get into biodiversity. It creates an additional biodiversity on the farm. It reduces the need for pesticides because it breaks some of the cycles of pests and pathogens. It sort of preserves the nutrient profile of soils by making sure that it's not one crop which eats up a lot of nitrogen, so you're reducing nitrogen. So then you want to plant your peas so that it brings nitrogen back into the soil. And so I do want to say that while carbon is important, healthy soils provide a lot of ecosystem services. They improve water storage and filtration, which is incredibly important, especially in dry areas. It increased carbon capture and storage, we've talked about that. Enhanced biological function and diversity, greater productive capacity. This again is making sure that you have a very healthy microbial community that is working on that nutrient cycling. And it really, healthy soil sort of is the underpinning of a resilient system in general. Without healthy soils, your systems are much easier to be disrupted by a heat dome, for example, in Washington, or by some of the other impacts of climate change. And so that all sounds really good. Okay, we just need to do these things and it'll all be wonderful. But there are lots of challenges. It's really easy to say, if we just do these practices, it'll be great. But how do you measure that? And we do not know. We have anecdotal evidence, and there's evidence starting to build that is linking outcomes to practices. But it is extremely complex, and a lot more work needs to be done so that we can actually say to a farmer, if you implement this practice, if you plant these cover crops and integrate that with using this organic fertilizer, that it is going to have this impact, whether it's going to store this much carbon, or it's going to increase the productivity of your soil, or it's going to increase the nutrient density of the food that you're growing. There are all kinds of claims that are being made, but we don't have the measurement systems that we need to really be able to measure the impact. And what's interesting is just recently the USDA set aside a big chunk of money, I think it's like $100 million, to start trying to create that linkage between practice and outcome. And because they recognize, like, everyone wants to do these things, but how do we know really what we're accomplishing when we implement these practices? And so some people are focused on, who cares? Let's just implement the practices. Other people, so the US government, it's like, we want to give money to people who are going to farm sustainably. Are they going to say, you need to show us outcomes to get the money, or are they just going to say, we're going to give you money to implement the practices? And that is a debate that's going on here in Washington as well. What do we want to pay farmers to do? How do we want to measure what it is that they're doing? We have issues with quantifying soil carbon. There's no standard measurement for soil carbon. Different soils accumulate in soil and store carbon differently. The soil carbon is, do you measure it the upper levels of the soil or the lower levels of the soil? When do you measure it? Because it's going to change throughout the year. There are all kinds of questions that need to be answered in terms of how do we actually measure how carbon is being stored in soils, and that goes back to practices as well. A key challenge is risk. So we have an agricultural system which uses a pretty standard set of practices, and we want to ask farmers to change the way they work, change the practices they implement. Farming is incredibly risky. That's the other thing farmers are. They're risk assessors. And so when we ask a farmer to change something that they're doing, they're assuming more risk. And a lot of farmers, they can have one catastrophic year. They may adopt a practice and it fails miserably, and that could be the end for them. I mean, farmers generally, a tradition, maybe not ADM or one of the big, agri-system farmers, but your average family farm, they live on the edge a lot of the time. And so one catastrophe means the end for them. And so we need to find ways to incentivize farmers to take those risks, to adopt those new practices, to become innovators, and help us figure out how we can actually transform the system. It's going to really be up to farmers to make this happen. The carbon market is a challenge. There's a lot of interest in the carbon market, which is where carbon emitters can invest in industries or practices that in theory sequester carbon, and that allows them to emit more carbon because they're sequestering carbon over here. The problem is we don't know how to measure carbon in soils yet. So claims are being made, soil stores carbon, and they're trying to create carbon markets without really understanding soil carbon completely yet. And we're seeing this happen even in the forest industry. We know that there's been research done now because carbon emitters are investing in forest lands, saying that forests sequester carbon. But more data is showing that it really depends on how that forest is managed. If it's not managed properly, it's also emitting carbon, and you end up emitting more carbon as opposed to less. The same can happen in looking at farms as being farmers as farming carbon as opposed to farming food. It's a challenging area. It's an area that we need to look at carefully. And then I think finally that it's easy to say, I'm going to do cover cropping and stop there, like, great, I'm regenerative, I'm doing cover cropping. I'm doing no-till, I'm regenerative. But actually, these practices work better when they're integrated systematically. They each impact the other. And the greatest impact you're going to get is when you adopt them as some kind of, in a systematic way, in sort of an organic system as opposed to any singular practice. Okay, now I'm going to just talk a little bit about organic and regenerative, because that is also a very touchy area. Organic and I'm going to focus on accountability. If we look at the definition of organic agriculture, a holistic and sustainable approach to farming that minimizes the use of synthetic inputs, emphasizes the use of natural biological processes, et cetera, et cetera. And then we look at regenerative, a system of farming principles and practices that increases biodiversity, enriches soils, sequesters carbon, improves watersheds. There's really not a whole lot of difference between them. And there's not a whole lot of difference between them and the definition of agroecology for that matter, except it doesn't include the social and political as much. Although you can see regenerative specifically says and benefits society. A lot of small farmers are in particular, I work with a lot of small farmers here in Washington. They're very interested in regenerative because regenerative is seen and is often defined as bigger than organic. So it goes beyond what organic is trying to do. It includes more values, social values. At least the claim is. But if you talk to someone who is really dedicated to organic, they will say, no, organic includes, organic actually encompasses all of the values of regenerative. The challenge is that, so ideally, both of them accomplish all of these things. Use cover crop, green manures, biological controls, emphasis on biodiversity, rotational grazing and cropping, reduction of external and off-farm inputs, focus on renewable resources. These are all tenets, these are all practices that both organic and regenerative comply with. The big difference is organic goes through a certification process. Regenerative generally does not have a certification process, although there is a regenerative certification, but it requires you to be certified organic before you can then add on top of that a regenerative certification. And so organic foods are grown and processed according to federal guidelines. There are very specific guidelines around what you must do to be certified organic. And organic farms are inspected annually in order to maintain their certification. And so that's what the organic department at the Washington State Department of Agriculture does. They certify farms and they inspect farms to ensure that they're complying with the federal regulations around organic certification. There are problems. I will say, whenever the government, it's both really great and problematic that the government has taken on organic certification. We wouldn't be able to have the sort of the guidelines and regulations, and there is an advisory committee that advises the federal government in sort of every year they review all the regulations, they add new products, they take products that can be used out of the list of products that can be used by organic farmers. There's a process for continuous improvement, but it's very bureaucratic. There is paperwork that's involved. It does put more of a burden on the organic farmer. What they get in exchange for that is they can sell their products for more money. Now, so there's an important market that organic farmers occupy that can be seen as threatened by a regenerative claim, which does not undergo a certification process, so there is no accountability. This is a challenge that the community in general is trying to deal with and figuring out how, regenerative needs to be better defined. Do we have to also burden regenerative farmers with paperwork and bureaucracy? How can we have accountability without it being too much of a burden? And it's an important question. The other problem with regenerative is there is greenwashing going on, and you will see, for example, that General Mills and McDonald's are both starting to incentivize their farmers or trying to ask their farmers to adopt regenerative practices and call themselves regenerative. But you will see, for example, that they say no-till. They want their farmers to be no-till, and they want them to use cover crops. That's all good. So the farmers will plant cover crops, but then what do they do with their cover crops? when it's time to terminate them. They terminate them with Roundup. So you end up with a system which is using extensive use of herbicides in order to achieve the no-till practice and the cover cropping practice. Organic farmers and regenerative farmers see that as really problematic. And it's a way for some of these large corporations, and I'm not saying they're trying to do the right thing, but from the perspective of organic regenerative farmers, they're going about it the wrong way. And it's a problem because they are now co-opting the name regenerative. Just a quick snapshot, we have 944 certified organic farms out of 35,500 farms in Washington. Not a lot, but it has grown a lot over the years. There we have 769 million in farm gate sales, or 8.6% of all agricultural sales. But we are number 2 in the nation after California for the amount of farm gate sales that we have of organic products. And we are number 1 in the nation in terms of the production of organic apples. We are number 1 in the nation in terms of production of organic blueberries. We are very close with onions, asparagus. So we actually, there are specific specialty crops that we really have done a lot with in terms of organic production. I'm going to skip through a few of these because I want actually to get to this last piece because I have no idea how much time I have left. Yay! Okay. So one of the problems with organic is people talk about it being expensive, which it is. It costs more. And it's sort of like, how do you reduce the costs? And some people put that on the farmer. Like the farmer needs to get more efficient. The farmer needs to make less money. And it's kind of like, no, like farmers need to earn a fair wage, just like the rest of us. It shouldn't be, their cost is their cost, and they need to earn a fair wage. They need to be able to have a viable business. So what is really going on here that makes organic expensive? Well, number one, there are lots of hidden costs associated with conventional agriculture. These are the externalities that are associated with it that have actually a monetary value that is not being recognized, and if it were recognized, would actually increase the cost of food which is produced using conventional, quote unquote, conventional methods. And the FAO, which is the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, I think it's called, that they've estimated the hidden cost of current agrisystems add up to over 10 trillion in harm to human health, ecosystems, and the economy. And the other part of this, so you have externalities. The other part of this is that there is a ton of money that's being poured into our agricultural economy by our government, the USDA. And this is as a result of the Farm Bill, which I'll touch on in a minute. But you can see here that between 1995 and 2016, there was $350 billion, which were poured into programs which can be segmented out into these basic areas. There are commodity programs, and these are programs that support commodities. They're price supports, and it's corn, basically corn, soy, cotton, sugar. And a lot of the corn that's grown isn't even for food, it's for ethanol. And so, and these crops often, most of that money goes to crops that are grown on a very large scale, monocultures using traditional agricultural practices. Very little of that money goes to farmers who are using organic practices. So here you can see exactly, corn gets 29% of that money, of the commodity money. Wheat, I forgot to mention wheat, soybeans, cotton. So it is going primarily to these commodity crops. And then if you look at the green here, there is about 13%, I think, of the money of USDA subsidies go to what are called conservation practices. And that you can see that is the green section. It has gone up and down. It is not very large. The brown is the commodity. The blue is crop insurance. And crop insurance is really to help mitigate risk. There's also an issue with crop insurance that it's much more difficult. Organic production is different from commodity production. It's harder for them to qualify for crop insurance. So they don't have, that tool is largely not available to organic farmers. And so where does all this money come from? It comes from the Farm Bill, which is the single largest piece of legislation that was ever passed by Congress. It's an omnibus bill because it contains several large buckets of money. And primarily, it provides money for three things. About 80% goes to nutrition services. That is SNAP, EBT. It's money to help provide food to low-income families. And it's funny that the Farm Bill was actually implemented in the depths of the Depression and during the Dust Bowl, when farming practices, it was a sort of a combination of a climate incident and farming practices that were creating issues. And there was, this was, I don't know if any of you read The Grapes of Wrath, but there was a lot of farms went broke, farmers were moving west, poverty, a lot of hungry people, issues with farm conservation, too much production, prices were dropping. It was sort of this really bad cycle. And so this bill originally was intended to address some of those issues. And so a new farm bill has been passed every 5 to 7 years ever since the first farm bill was introduced. And you can see that in addition, if we look at the rest of it, there is 9% crop insurance, 7% commodities, and 7% conservation. This was the 2018 Farm Bill, which is just ending, and we're moving into, right now, the 2023 Farm Bill. It was supposed to have been passed in September. It's probably not going to get passed till sometime in 2024, hard to say when, given everything that's going on in the government. But something will happen. So the landscape, so the first Farm Bill was implemented when, there were this crisis in the agricultural industry. And that was when we had like 5 million farms in the United States. They were relatively small. And the landscape, and there were very specific issues that the Farm Bill was trying to address. Since the Farm Bill was passed in the Farm Bills of the 30s and 40s were passed, the landscape has changed significantly. There are now only about 550,000 farms that earn more than $50,000. So we have, it's actually the opposite. We have a lot of very large industrial farms and many fewer small farms. And these industrial farms have been able to, most of the money coming out of the Farm Bill is now going, the industry is consolidated, is now going to these large entities. And to a great extent, they have control. They have the lobbyists that are in Washington that have a lot of influence, and they're able to have a lot of influence over where those subsidies go. And so it's been a real fight to try and move money, and this is why the food can be cheap. This is why a lot of food is cheap, because these subsidies sort of provide money so that pricing can stay low. So a lot of work is being done to try and move that money, some of that money, or just bring additional money into smaller farmers who, for the most part, are farming more sustainably, less industrialized, and even more money into farmers that are farming organically or regeneratively. So according to the 2012 Ag Census, 3.2 million farmers operate 2.1 million farms. This is what I was trying to get to, but only about 500,000 of these report sales of more than $50,000. 1% of farms in America receive 10% of all the money that comes out of the Farm Bill. So you can see that a lot of the money is, it's like the 1%. That's exactly what it is. And these are the projections. Right now, this is kind of what the Farm Bill for 2024 to 2028 looks like. And you can see it's actually quite a bit larger. It's grown a lot. There's a lot of money. And so the last point I want to make really quickly is we do need a new approach. I mean, we need money to flow to, if we are going to realize the benefits of organic and regenerative farming, once we're able to measure them, I should say, but if we're going to realize the benefits of really focusing on healthy soil, we need to move money to those farmers who are implementing the practices, taking the risks, innovating, because there's a lot of innovation going on in this area. And that is a huge task. It's turning the Titanic. But what you can see here is the recent Inflation Reduction Act that was passed in 2022. They put a whole bunch of money into programs that are doing just that. And it's a first step, and it was one way that we were able to start feeding more resources to sustainable ag. And now people are trying to say that this money needs to be incorporated into the new Farm Bill. This needs to stay. It can't just be a one-shot deal. Whether or not we're going to be successful is a question. This is where advocacy comes in, and this is where the Coalition for Organic and Regenerative Agriculture comes in, and we're putting together a coalition of food activists, organic farmers, to sort of be a voice for the organic regenerative community, and both in Washington and with regard to the Farm Bill, working with national organizations like the Organic Trade Association, Organic Farmers Association, the National Sustainable Ag Coalition. These are important organizations that are doing this important work. And so I recommend that all of you become members of one of those organizations. And that's all I got. And I don't know if there are any questions or comments, but I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Melissa. We have time for one question. Yeah.
So when you're talking about like your, comparing organic and regenerative, is like your primary issue seems to be that there is really no like certifications, or there is a regenerative certification standard,
right,
but it's not like a federal big thing. Was your opinion on the differences between the two? Like, would you say that regenerative is a potentially better option were it certified to the same like standard that like organic is?
Yes, but I don't want to build a new house. And this is where there's the potential for continual improvement in organic. And so regenerative is really working to be broader in terms of what it's the value system. But I think we have to start with organic. That house has been built. It's a good house. It's on a good foundation. We need to take that house and put an addition on it. Because otherwise we're just like starting over from scratch. It just doesn't make sense, And, the real problem is that there's a bureaucracy government creates bureaucracy. There's just no doubt about it. And so organic farmers deal with a lot of bureaucracy that's painful. And it's like, in an ideal world, we would look at that bureaucracy and try and simplify it. And then amplify and then create, the new, some additional standards and requirements that would then encompass what regenerative is. That would be my deal.
Thank you so much. The students will be invited to share comments and further questions, and we'll share them with you as a for your information.
That'd be great.
I love this analogy of an addition onto a house with a strong foundation. I love the synthesis that you brought that really expanded on some of the concepts that we've been exploring and really put them in the Washington State context. Thank you so much, Melissa. Let's give one more round of applause.
Thank you.